They called him the Man of Steel, but behind the portraits and parades was a man so paranoid he rewrote his own past, erased his friends, and feared his doctors more than his enemies. Stalin didn't just rule the Soviet Union, he staged it, frame by frame, like a terrifying theater of loyalty and lies. What history books politely skip over is just how far his delusion went, from ghost trains to invisible enemies, and how close he came to destroying himself before anyone else could. Fact 1. The man who erased his own face. Stalin's obsession with rewriting history went beyond propaganda. He literally deleted people from photographs. Once you fell from favor, Soviet editors would airbrush you out, as if you'd never existed. But Stalin didn't stop with his enemies. In some rare prints, even his own image was retouched, made taller, slimmer, more heroic. In a country starving for bread, entire studios spent nights painting him new cheekbones. When one archivist asked why Stalin's medal count changed from photo to photo, an officer replied coldly, "Comrade Stalin's greatness grows each year. The photos must reflect that." Fact 2. The Library of Fear. Few knew that Stalin's private library was marked not by dust, but by rage. Over 20,000 books, all underlined, annotated, sometimes with furious red ink. Margins full of curses against traitors and fools. He'd scribble "liar" next to historians who praised Lenin too much, and underline entire passages about paranoia or power, sometimes adding "correct." The dictator treated books like enemies he could still argue with. One volume on Caesar had this note scrawled in the back: "Even the mighty are betrayed by friends." A year later, he executed half of his own inner circle. Fact 3. The Poisoned Doctors. In 1952, Stalin became convinced that Kremlin doctors were plotting to kill him, a Zionist conspiracy, as he called it. His guards whispered that he'd stopped sleeping, listening for footsteps outside his room. The doctors' plot sent dozens of innocent physicians to prison. Ironically, when Stalin finally collapsed from a stroke, no doctor dared to approach him for hours. His guards waited, terrified to act without orders from a dying man. When they finally entered, he was lying on the carpet, one hand clenched, pointing at the ceiling, as if accusing someone still hiding there. Fact 4. The Ghost Train. When Stalin traveled, the Soviet Union froze. Entire rail lines were cleared for his armored train. A black steel serpent no one was allowed to look at. Villagers near the tracks were ordered to close their shutters as it passed. No one knew which train he was on. Decoys ran in different directions to confuse would-be assassins. Even his engineers didn't know their final destination until the last minute. One driver later confessed he drove 3 days straight with his windows covered. "I only knew we'd arrived," he said, "when they told me to stop breathing." Stalin's journey was a moving fortress of fear, cutting across his own empire like a shadow. Fact 5. The man who banned jokes. Under Stalin, laughter could be lethal. Joking about the government, even privately, was treated as counter-revolutionary activity. People vanished for whispering a pun about collective farms. One man was arrested for telling his wife that Stalin's moustache looked tired. When the secret police came, she reportedly shouted, "It was my joke." They took her too. Yet the absurdity reached higher levels. Official state comedians were required to submit their jokes for approval, like military reports. In a place where humor died first, silence became the only safe form of laughter. Fact 6. The cinema that lied. Stalin loved movies, but only if they worshipped him. He watched films every night, sometimes demanding reshoots because the peasants didn't smile enough. He personally edited scripts, adding heroic speeches for his on-screen doubles. One director recalled Stalin calling him after midnight to debate camera angles. "Comrade," Stalin said, "even I must look human sometimes." But his censorship was so precise it made truth impossible. Every film became a sermon, every smile forced. In the land of propaganda, cinema became a mirror, and Stalin made sure it showed only his reflection. Fact 7. The orphan's secret. Stalin often boasted about his humble Georgian roots, but he quietly destroyed evidence of his own family. His father was a violent drunk who beat him and abandoned the family. His mother scrubbed floors to feed him. Later, Stalin had her letters hidden from the public. Too soft, too human. Yet when she died in 1937, at the height of the purges, he didn't attend the funeral. He sent flowers and a message: "Let her rest." That night, he reportedly told an aide, "I trust no one, not even my mother." The orphan of Georgia had become the father of fear. Fact 8. The parade of shadows. Every May Day, Stalin appeared on the Kremlin balcony, waving to oceans of soldiers and banners. But those beside him changed every year. Men once hailed as heroes suddenly gone, their faces missing from next year's photographs. Even the crowd knew what that meant. The silence under the cheering was heavy. No one dared look up too long. A woman later recalled, "We clapped until our hands hurt, because if we stopped, someone might notice. In the square below, thousands shouted his name." Above them, Stalin smiled faintly, as if testing how long applause could drown the sound of disappearing lives. Fact 9. The night of the telephone. Every Soviet official dreaded the ringing phone after midnight. It meant only one thing: Stalin was awake. He would call ministers, generals, even actors, just to ask questions no one dared answer. What do you think of this poem? Would you die for me? Silence could be fatal, but the wrong tone was worse. One general's wife said she could tell if her husband would live another week by how pale he was after a call. Stalin's voice traveled through those wires like a curse, soft, polite, and deadly. By dawn, another name was usually crossed off some unseen list. Fact 10. The War of the Maps. During World War II, Stalin spent hours poring over maps in his bunker, moving pins, drawing arrows, shouting at generals who were too afraid to correct him. Once he insisted that a division was advancing, though it had been wiped out 3 days earlier. No one dared tell him. "Comrade Stalin sees further than we do," a marshal said quietly, and everyone nodded. When victory finally came, he took full credit. The men who'd won it for him were already being interrogated. For Stalin, the war was not fought on battlefields but on paper, and paper could never argue back. Fact 11. The actor in uniform. Though he dressed in plain tunics, Stalin was obsessed with his own image. He never wore medals in public until after 1943, when victory seemed certain. Then came the transformation. The humble man of the people suddenly appeared covered in gold. His portraits showed him as a general, even though he'd never commanded a single battle. Behind the camera, he micromanaged every pose. How high to lift his chin, how firm to clench his hand. An aide once said he acted like a man trying to look humble while being worshipped. And in a sense, that was his greatest role. Fact 12. The banquet of fear. At Stalin's nightly banquets, fear was the main course. He would drink heavily, then force others to match him glass for glass. Refusing was dangerous, but so was keeping up. He'd toast his guests, laugh, then suddenly accuse someone of treason mid-meal. Once he invited a loyal friend, the composer Dmitri Shostakovich, and made him play piano until dawn. When the exhausted musician stopped, Stalin merely nodded and said, "Music keeps the soul awake." By morning, another guest was missing. These dinners weren't feasts, they were rehearsals for survival. Every laugh was weighed, every glance remembered. The dictator didn't need poison, he had power, and that was enough to make anyone choke. Fact 13. The shadow of Beria. Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's secret police chief, was the only man who could enter his office unannounced. And everyone else feared him more than death itself. Beria brought Stalin women, prisoners, even confessions before they were written. But he also kept a file on Stalin himself. Every illness, every outburst, every moment of weakness. Stalin once told him, half jokingly, "You'd kill me if I gave you the order." Beria smiled and said, "Comrade Stalin, I would never disobey you." That was the problem. Both statements were true. Their friendship was built on blackmail, and both men knew who'd pull the trigger first if the chance came. Fact 14. The War on Faith. Stalin declared religion an enemy of progress, and yet, when the war turned against him in 1941, he quietly reopened churches. Priests were freed from gulags to bless tanks heading for the front. The same man who once ordered Bibles burned now toasted to Holy Russia in public speeches. It wasn't faith, it was strategy. After victory, he shut the doors again. One priest who'd survived both the persecution and the brief revival said bitterly, "We were soldiers in a war God didn't start." Stalin didn't believe in heaven or hell. He thought he could build both on earth, and he nearly did. Fact 15. The children of the revolution. Stalin loved to call young Soviets his children, yet his real family was shattered by his rule. His eldest son, Yakov, was captured by the Germans. When they offered to exchange him for a German general, Stalin refused, saying, "I don't trade soldiers for officers." Yakov later died in a camp, throwing himself against an electric fence. His daughter, Svetlana, would later flee to the West, calling her father a moral monster. Even in his final years, Stalin surrounded himself with portraits of Lenin. but never his own family. The man who ruled millions could not save the few who bore his name. Fact 16. The Last Toast. In March 1953, Stalin gathered his inner circle for dinner. They drank until late, laughing through their fear. Afterward, he went to bed and was found the next morning on the floor, paralyzed, his eyes wide open. The guards stood outside his door for hours, waiting for orders that would never come. When they finally entered, he was still alive, gasping, unable to speak. Beria arrived, looked at him, and reportedly said, "He's fine, don't bother the doctors yet." It was revenge served cold and slow. Stalin lay there for more than a day before dying, his empire already whispering about freedom. The man who trusted no one was finally surrounded by silence. Fact 17. The House of Secrets. After Stalin's death, investigators entered his private dacha for the first time. Inside, they found rooms sealed for years, full of dusty globes, unopened letters, and drawers of photographs of people long executed. On one shelf, a glass case held pipes, perfectly arranged like museum relics. The air smelled of tobacco and damp paper. In the corner was a gramophone that hadn't played since the 1930s. One officer said it felt like walking into a place where time had refused to move. The dictator had built a world he could control, then locked himself inside it. A prison decorated with trophies of fear. Fact 18. The Files That Never Existed. When Stalin died, the NKVD archives began to burn. Whole truckloads of documents vanished overnight, erased like the people they condemned. Some clerks cried as they fed files into the fire. Others worked silently, afraid to stop. Among the ashes were reports signed with false names, confessions written under torture, and letters of loyalty that meant nothing anymore. History was rewritten again, but this time by trembling hands trying to save themselves. By dawn, Moscow smelled of smoke and something like guilt. Stalin's greatest weapon had not been the gun, but the file, and even in death, it still killed truth. Fact 19. The funeral no one believed. When Stalin's body was displayed in the Hall of Columns, thousands came to see him, some to mourn, others to make sure he was truly dead. The crowd was so massive that people were crushed to death trying to get inside. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, it was chaos, a country that didn't know how to grieve, only how to obey. One old woman was heard shouting, "Don't let him rise again," before being dragged away. The state called it a day of mourning. For millions, it felt like the first breath after years underwater. Fact 20. The fall of his statues. Within months, his portraits began to vanish. Streets renamed, cities de-Stalinized. Workers, once forced to shout his name, now quietly pulled down his statues. But fear lingered. One sculptor who helped dismantle a monument said, "We whispered, even though the bronze couldn't hear us." In Georgia, his hometown, erected a new statue, not of glory, but of stone indifference. Children threw pebbles at it. For the first time in decades, people could laugh again, and that laughter was more revolutionary than any speech. Fact 21. The myths that survived. Even after his crimes were revealed, some still worshipped him. Old soldiers kept his portrait beside their medals. Farmers said he was strict but fair. Propaganda had sunk too deep. The myth of Stalin outlived the man, haunting generations that couldn't imagine power without fear. In Soviet classrooms, teachers stumbled over his name, not sure whether to curse it or whisper it. The truth was dangerous, even when everyone already knew it. Stalin had died, but his echo ruled the silence he left behind. Fact 22. The clock that stopped. The night Stalin died, a guard in his dacha noted the exact time, 9:50 p.m. The clock in Stalin's room was later found broken, its hands frozen at that moment. No one dared repair it. For years, visitors said the silence in that room felt heavier than any monument. The curtains still hung drawn, the bed untouched, the air unmoving. Somewhere beyond those walls, a new world was starting, uncertain, imperfect, but finally breathing. The man of steel was gone, yet the fear he forged still ticked quietly in every Soviet heart. Stalin once said, "A single death is a tragedy. A million is a statistic." But his own death became something stranger. The moment a nation realized it had been living inside someone else's nightmare. History tried to erase him, just as he erased so many others. Yet every scar, every silence, every broken clock still remembers.